Yeah. Here we are at Slains Castle, north of Cruden Bay, and we're going to tell you a story about how oil came to be connected with Cruden Bay. And this beautiful location is, it's at its best this time of year, and it's hard to imagine that we're right on the doorstep of one of the most important industrial sites in the UK. Here we are in 2021, and it's now 50 years since the development of the giant Forties field was announced, with the plans to bring the oil ashore through a pipeline to Cruden Bay and onwards down to BP's refinery in Grangemouth. It's also less well known that it's 100 years since the discovery of the first oil field in Scotland, onshore in Midlothian, just south of Edinburgh. So there's more to the story than meets the eye. And the 1920s was a really quite interesting period in time. A lot of transitions taking place. Even as now we're talking about another energy transition. Looking back 150 years ago, the oil that people used in their lamps, in the bothies and castles around here was largely whale oil. And whaling was a big industry in Peterhead. Both whales and seals were hunted for their oil. And the oil industry that we know today actually displaced that oil industry in an energy transition back in the late 1800s. So energy transitions are not anything new. So just as mineral oil started to replace the whale oil in the 1800s, here we are in our lifetime, and in the 2020s we're seeing the shift away from mineral oil to renewable energy. And the evidence of that can be seen in the seas around us, with wind farms to the north off Peterhead and wind farms to the south off Aberdeen. We can see where our electricity is going to be generated by the amazing wind resources that lie off our shores. But not only wind, the future also belongs to hydrogen. And we will see in the coming years hydrogen being generated from natural gas coming ashore at St. Fergus, and we'll see hydrogen generated from seawater using wind power. And hydrogen then will fuel our home, even our agricultural vehicles, perhaps even our aeroplanes. The 1920s was a time of transition in many other ways also. Slains Castle, behind us here, was the home of the Earls of Errol, who had lived in this part of the land for over 700 years. But in the 20s, the castle was sold and eventually dismantled. This transition that was marked by the selling of Slains Castle demonstrated that wealth was moving from the landed nobility to the industrialists and the businessmen who were making their fortune in the early part of the 20th century. People like Andrew Carnegie, Viscount Cowdray, others who actually also have connections with oil. Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire people will recognise the name of Viscount Cowdray as the owner of Dunecht estates and Dunotter Castle. They'll also probably recognise his name from the Cowdray Hall or the Cowdray Club, or perhaps even the Cowdray Pavilion at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. But Cowdray was an oilman. He started out with a civil engineering company, ended up with a contract to build a railway in Mexico, and found oil along the way. Built up a company called Mexican Eagle that was ultimately purchased by Shell and brought the Mex into the Shell Mex organisation. Cowdray was the man that the Ministry of Munitions, acting on behalf of the government, contacted during the First World War to help them to find oil in the UK. So why were we looking for oil in the United Kingdom? Well, the answer lies with Winston Churchill, before the war, converting the Navy to run on oil instead of coal. And that had great advantages for the ships, but all the oil came from overseas. And once the war started, German submarines were sinking an amazing tonnage of British shipping and putting our supply lines for oil at risk. So we needed to find out if we had oil here, and more oil than was available from the shale oil industry in the West Lothian area at that time. So Viscount Cowdray, on behalf of the Ministry of Munitions, brought across some American drillers and some old-style percussion drilling rigs and drilled 11 exploration wells in the UK. 2 of those were in Scotland. One near West Calder, the first one, in the shale oil heartlands, and the second just south of Edinburgh near Dalkeith. And that second well found oil, found a small oil field called the Midlothian field in 1922. But why not here? And the answer lies in the rock. This ancient igneous granite rock is the last kind of rock that you would ever look for oil in. It has no porosity to hold the oil and no permeability to allow it to flow through. So this, ironically, is the last place on earth you would come looking for oil. As you can tell from the dates, the oil discoveries in the UK came a little bit late to have any impact on the First World War. But as we mentioned, the 1920s was a time of many transitions. And one of the big transitions of the 1920s was the political transition, the arrival of the Labour Party, first as a party of opposition and then as a party of government in 1924. Now, the oil discoveries got caught up in a political dispute. A lot of the Labour MPs were elected from coal mining constituencies, and at that time the coal under land belonged to the landowners. So the question arose, who owned the oil that had been found onshore in the UK? The Labour movement was not about to hand control of that resource to the landowners who already made money out of being on land that had coal beneath it. The issue was not actually resolved until the early 1930s, at which point it was resolved in favour of the state. The state was the owner of the oil resources found in the UK. Once that had been resolved, exploration kicked off again in the 1930s, and there were further discoveries, most notably in Sherwood Forest, near a village called Yckring. And there, just before the outbreak of another world war, they found a really large onshore oil field. And echoing the experience of the First World War, again, American drillers and American rigs were brought over to accelerate the development of that project. And a significant amount of oil was produced from Sherwood Forest during the Second World War. But even more significantly was a well drilled on the Yorkshire coast near Whitby. It found some gas, but the real importance was that the formations that were discovered by that well were the same as the formations in Germany that were known to contain oil fields. Just perhaps those rocks in Yorkshire extended all the way across to Germany. At the time, there was no technology for drilling offshore. That began to appear in the 1940s and 50s, notably in the Gulf Coast of the United States. And then the big thing that happened was in 1959, the discovery of the Groningen gas field in the Netherlands, which was seen to extend offshore into the North Sea. At that point, geologists and oilmen began to look at the North Sea with a whole different perspective. Instead of looking at the ancient rocks here in the northeast of Scotland and the ancient rocks in Norway, they looked at the rocks that were being found further south and began to recognise that the North Sea was what they would describe as a sedimentary basin that had exactly the kind of rocks you need, both to generate oil, to store it, and to seal it in place. And so we're here in the Castle Woods in Cruden Bay. It's not quite Sherwood Forest, but it's a good point to transition our story from the oil finds of 100 years ago to the beginning of the North Sea story.